In this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, Tom Fox and Matt Kelly take a deep dive into the recently released HanesBrands cybersecurity breach, where the company reported $100 million in lost sales in Q2 2022 due to a cybersecurity breach. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another live recording of Compliance Into the Weeds. Today, we're going to take up a blog post that Matt wrote last week and the facts around the HanesBrands cyber attack. So, Matt, first of all, welcome back.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
So, Matt, we had a massive cyber breach at HanesBrands. Lots of interesting aspects to this. I think we'll probably be learning more about this matter. But what struck you at this point about this matter?
Well, so this was really interesting because the backstory is that Hanes, its second quarter earnings report last week, and, that quarterly report terrible, and that is not a surprise. We could get into a little bit of that. But amidst the bad numbers, Hanes also gave more disclosure of a cybersecurity attack it had previously announced in May, right after the thing happened. But most disclosures we see from companies about cybersecurity attacks, they are actually privacy breaches. The company ends up reporting, we suffered this breach, we lost this many milliards, and it's going to cost us this much money to fix everything. And that's not what we saw with Hanes. They have a privacy breach. They had a ransomware attack where a order fulfillment system knocked offline for 3 weeks, and therefore they lost about $100 in sales for the quarter. $100 million, that did not happen. We rarely see disclosures like this about a ransomware attack where you're not talking about revenue you never received because your operations were tied in knots. So that unto itself is worth looking at. And because the SEC has these proposed new rules for disclosing cybersecurity events, this is very instructive for if you did suffer like Hanes, and we all know a lot of companies do, and they're not saying much about it right now, but if you did, how would you think through questions of materiality and internal controls, and what is or is not an effective internal control, and how you should be thinking through a lot of these issues with these new forthcoming cybersecurity disclosures that the SEC is going to adopt sometime soon. I don't know when, but that's coming. So for various reasons, the Hanes case is really interesting for compliance officers, CISOs, and audit executives to think through, how would you navigate these sort of issues?
So, Matt, certainly the headline grabber was the $100 million in lost sales. What struck me as significant about this matter initially was that we had, for the first time, a very early reported above the line or top of the line loss, and that was the $100 million in sales, not a cost afterwards. But also, this was not the first report by Hanes on their breach. They had previously reported it as well. And the question that I immediately had when I saw the headline last week was one that you addressed in your blog post was, when is it appropriate, or at what point, and here I'm referring to the proposed SEC regulations, when will it be appropriate to report a cybersecurity breach, i.e. when does it become material? Within 4 days of the breach? How would you know? You walked through some proposed calculations. Could you tell us how you thought through that issue?
Sure. So what Hanes did do is, according to its SEC filings, the Rand attack, they discovered it on May 24th. By 1 week later, 31st of this year, they disclosed very briefly, we have a cybersecurity attack. It is a ransomware attack. We are investigating the implications. And that was pretty much all the disclosure from May. But it happened about 7 days after the attack was discovered. Now, fast forward to, I think it was August 11th was the date of the 10 filing. They announced, well, it was a ransomware attack disrupted our supply chain operations. Our order fulfillment were down for 3 weeks. It cost us $100 million in revenue, $5 million lost in operating profit, cents cut from our share. So like some pretty fulsome disclosure, but it came several months after that initial news that we have this happening. If you do, Hanes reported $1.5 billion in sales for the quarter. And they said the ransomware attack cost about $100 million. It implies that they would have $1.6 billion. They lost $100 million because of the ransomware. The math, that means the ransomware attack cut their projections by 6.2% for the quarter. That is a material item, period. 6.2 is an enormous percentage for anything. Material loss could probably be somewhere as low as 1 or 2%, depending on exactly how you fuss over the details. But a breach or a rank of that nature, of that magnitude, that is material, should be disclosed. However, that's not actually what SEC rules right now. Right now, you have to disclose these things when they are material, and it's kind of vague when you should disclose it, but certainly by the time the next 10Q rolls around. That's what Hanes did. But under the proposed rules, you would have to disclose within 4 days of deciding that the attack material, not 4 days from when the attack happened. So you wouldn't have to disclose all that stuff on May 28th because it happened on May 24. Figuring all of that out in 4 days is probably going to be very, very difficult for a lot of companies. But 4 days after you realize, oh crap, this is material, that's when you would have to file a disclosure, not like what we saw in the 10Q. It was what, nearly 3 months later or 10 weeks later. But what they did put in the 10Q on August 11th was actually pretty on point for what he wants to see. How did it happen? Roughly, is it still ongoing? No, it's not. Are you still remediating? I think yes, we're. How much did it cost? Probably $100 million. Like there's a checklist that the SEC would like you to see, and they nailed it. But it was 10 weeks after they had this thing. If you think it through, looking at a material loss in sales, we'll be able to see that we think this is going to be our number for the sales for the quarter. Therefore, 1 or 2% of that would be material. So you would wind up having to track what are the potential losses that you have for every hour you're sitting on, or every day, or however you want to measure it. But some capability to figure out how much is ransomware costing me in operations I'm not executing. And as those losses start to tick up, eventually they're going to hit a threshold for, and I was expecting the report in another 3 months when I filed a 10Q. Now it's material, and now you have 4 days to figure it all out. That's the sort of challenge we are going to encounter very quickly once the SEC does adopt these rules. And I do think they're pretty much going them the way they're proposed. I haven't heard anybody say anything different yet. So you're going to need several capabilities of measuring what is material, what are your most important systems, how much revenue do they bring in, how much money are you losing through if they're down, all sorts of little calculus equations you're going to need to start running. That's what's going to have to be necessary to achieve the cybersecurity disclosure that we're all hoping to see.
So, Matt, one other issue that came up for me, and it was re-emphasized to me in your blog post, was you talked about several of the different corporate functions which would need to be involved to gather this information, make the decision, then make the appropriate disclosure. And I've worried, or at least thought about, how holistically companies need to view or review these matters. Should IT be in the room with compliance, in the room with legal, in the room with HR, in the room with senior management, in the room with comms, and probably a whole host of others? Or do you simply see companies reporting up the chain, IT, up to the chief information security officer, or who then reports to the CEO, who then reports to the board, who then instructs the CEO to take action, sort of up and down the chain. Any real thoughts on a holistic approach, or do you still get the sense that corporations are very siloed in this data and information, and so it's making it cumbersome to analyze and then report it?
Well, I mean, certainly, yeah, I think that is the case. And Tom, you're talking about people reporting chain and whatnot. At no point did you actually say, and then report it out to the investors in the world so we know what's going on. Let's not, investors are the ones who actually do own the company. And the whole point of the SEC's disclosure proposals is to keep these folks in the loop. So I do think that you start thinking that through as a company. And, as much as we should have probably IT and legal and compliance and corporate comms in the room to figure out what to do after each, sort of like to the right of the big boom, they actually need to be together and planning a lot out to the left of the boom before the event ever. For example, like I said, you would need to know which systems are actually mission critical for what supports the income statement revenue. If the hackers had knocked down Hanes corporate cafeteria for 3 weeks and everybody had to bring in their own food, yeah, that stings. But ultimately, that's not going to cost you $100 million in sales. Maybe if they had locked out R&D function for 3 weeks, would that cost $100 million in sales? Probably not. I don't know. Maybe they're designing some new pair of underwear or something, but I don't think that would really disrupt things right away. No. What are our most important systems? What vendors, service providers are supporting that system? How important are they? And if they go down, do we lose $30 a minute in sales? Do we lose $5 a minute in sales? Is that a lot? You would need to talk with your finance team to remember what is an actual material amount. And let me just do that terrible cue that Hanes had thrown out. Actually lost 238 million in sales. That million in sales lower than the go period. So there were other issues. Hanes was already normal routine business issues that, like I said, they're going through some stuff. They had a terrible quarter. They're in transition. Sales were already going to be lower than the year ago period anyway. So they weren't exactly sure where sales were going. And if you don't know where sales are going, it will get hard to figure out. So what's a material loss? Cyber event. So you'd need to keep track of all that, and what are the actual materials based on where our financial projections are. And those projections are in flux. So you would have to think that through. There's a whole lot of would have to happen there to make sure that when the incident strikes and when the boom is, you are in position to get ahead of it, or at least make sure that it is as small and minimal as necessary and no bigger. But that's going to require thinking through what are our collaborations and processes and capabilities that we're going to have to figure out in order to meet these disclosures, or at the least, not subject to the SEC. Even if for whatever the SEC never adopted these rules, there are going to be other parties who want to know what happened here, Hanes, or what happened to your business. I'm your customer. I'm your supplier, private equity backer. I want to know what's going on. And they're not going to tell me for 10 weeks for real. That's not going to be acceptable. So the more that any business can think through these capabilities you'll need, the better shape you're going in, whether it's to disclose to the SEC or to anybody else who has controlling the purse strings or otherwise has you hairs, that they want to know what's going on. That's why all of this matters.
You articulated a long list of potential stakeholders that would want to know this information. Let me maybe zero in on one that came up for me when you went through that list, and that is suppliers. We typically think of suppliers as having to certify to an end-using customer, here Hanes, not Hanes customer, but Hanes itself, that they have an appropriate level of cybersecurity. They have a SOC 2 certificate. Their employees have been trained, a variety of different cybersecurity standards that could be put in place. But what if you're a supplier and your customer, once again, Hanes or other manufacturer, sustains a breach, do you as a supplier then begin to ask questions of that customer? Could your breach somehow impact us if it got back to us? Do we need to now assess your cybersecurity capabilities as well?
Quite potentially, yes. It would depend on your exact IT people will call it dependencies of your software systems and your customers. When Target suffered its famous breach in 2013, that happened because somebody had hacked into the HVAC system vendor that Target used, and then went there because they had electronic bill pay, and they went from the HVAC system into Target's financial system. In theory, that would go both ways. So you could wind up wondering, are they going to hack into Hanes systems that then would somehow to me and my shipping and ordering? That's a possibility. More pressing for some suppliers and practically is just what if your customer can't take delivery of your stuff 3 weeks? What if it's perishable? Well, are you going to then ship it to somebody else, another customer of yours, and maybe send your raw there? And then with your Hanes, what do you do 3 weeks later? Open the loading bays, but now your supplier taken all your goods and sent them to somebody who actually could accept them. There's all sorts of operational ways that this could be very sticky. But yeah, totally, suppliers would be somebody who would have some questions to ask here. Up to, are we the ones responsible for this? We were hacked. We didn't know it, but we were just the vector to Hanes because they're a bigger company that could pay them some. There's a lot that we don't know about what this attack actually was and how it happened.
Well, and that brings me to my next point. Any sense, hint, or other intel around how this attack may have occurred?
No, yet. Other than to say it disrupted the supply chains. But we don't know. So did this happen because a Hanes employee for a phishing attack and implemented the malware directly? Happened because somebody hacked into one of Hanes or tech vendors? Did they forget to patch software? Did Hanes forget to patch its own software? We have no idea. But Tom, that I would want to bring up, at first I should say we don't know as a member of the public. It's not clear if Hanes has or hasn't got a good sense of how this attack happened, but they haven't actually. But for the rest of the risk and audit and audience, the point that I wanted to bring up was just imagine if the Hanes attack happened in the physical world. What would that look like? It would look like a couple of thugs changing on your warehouse and your loading bay, and then couldn't reopen the locks for 3 weeks, and you lose 100 million in sales. If that actually happened at a business, there would be so much hell to pay for the management team. You hardly know start. Certainly the shareholders would sue. If you are, say, a maker of retail goods like Hanes is, and you can't ship things to retail outlets, they're going to be unhappy. Maybe they're going to source their under competitor. I already mentioned if your suppliers stuff to the loading dock, they might just down to the next underwear and you don't have raw materials when you're finally ready for it. Customers might be unhappy, suppliers might be, investors will be unhappy. The audit firm that you have would probably say that is a material weakness in your inventory controls. Open the warehouse again. The audit committee would certainly want to have the management team impaled on the front lawn, because if the audit committee didn't do that, shareholders would do that to the audit committee next annual meeting. There are going to be regulators who are getting involved. My being that this would be a total mess in the physical world, this sort of attack. Nobody would stand for it. The thing that we need to think through today, because as we digitally transform all of our business processes, don't think it's going to be a very much longer before an attack like this happens in the digital world, where it will look a lot like this. And it's still going to be held. There's still bunches of people saying, how did this happen? Where did the consequences. Who thought this was a good cybersecurity system in the first place? Trolls. Where were the auditors testing it? Those kind of issues are going to get more and more, I think, in times to come. So, we're going to have some real issues to think through, just as internal controls.
The cost of this, I think I saw a statistic last week where we're getting close to almost $100 million in cost, total cost per cyberware attack. Even if it's half of that, 50 million, that's still a significant cost. But here, as I started off with, and the thing that struck me about this matter was the 100 million was above the line. And that's not money you can ever get back. That's not money you can reserve for. That is gone. And that impacts literally all of the stakeholders in an organization, even if it's just one stakeholder, the shareholders, or it's a variety of stakeholders as laid out by the Business Roundtable. So a lot to learn from this. I've really thought the way you helped us think through some of the questions on reporting and some of the other questions we explored in this podcast on how to prepare for and then report. Every compliance professional needs to study. And once again, I think this is a matter we might be well visiting in the future, Matt.
I think we will, because I don't think ransomware is going away, Tom.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance in the Weeds. If you have any comments or questions or like to leave us a review, please do so in the chat function. Matt and I look forward to visiting with you again next week.